Today is the 30th Sunday in Ordinary Time. Our first reading is from Exodus chapter 22, verse 20 through 26. Our psalm is Psalm 18. Our second reading is 1 Thessalonians chapter 1, verses 5 through 10. And our gospel is Matthew chapter 22, verses 34 to 40. In today's gospel, Jesus is dealing with the Pharisees once again. It has been 4 or 5 weeks now of Jesus talking to the Pharisees in our gospel readings. The Pharisees are a determined and relentless bunch. And many times in the readings, they come to Jesus with questions, not trying to learn anything, you understand, but trying to trap Jesus, to trick him into some sort of heresy or violation of the law. The Pharisees are very big on the law, rules and regs kind of folks. They're very big on the law and who is following the law and who's not following the law. And I can understand having rules and regs. I grew up in a Southern Baptist missionary family, so I know about rules. You can't cuss. You can't dance. You've seen Footloose, it's just like that. And Kevin Bacon comes and he saves them sometimes. And Baptists, they don't gamble, not even raffles. And they are scandalized by cakewalks, some of them. And Baptists don't drink, although there is some wiggle room on that one. One of my spiritual directors taught me about Baptist drinking. He said, "Why do you always bring 2 Baptists with you when you go fishing?" Well, if you only bring one, he'll drink all your beer. But officially, they don't drink. And, as I was growing up, I got tired of waiting for Kevin Bacon to come and save us, teach us how to dance. So when I moved away from home, I quit church altogether. I had to get away from all that religiosity. And I stayed away for a long time. I didn't want any religious rules in my life. And God let me go because we have free will. God let me go and experience life without His rules. But what I found is there are still rules out there. My friend Hampton would always say, you gotta have rules. And of course he was generally using that phrase as a basic explanation for why he got to ride shotgun, or he got to pick the music, or he got the last chicken nugget, or whatever. Basically, why he was superior to me was because you gotta have rules. I guess that was his rule. But we'll get back to Hampton in a minute. So you see, God let me go, but God is merciful and loving and forgiving, and so He called me back, and He brought me back, and I thank Him every day that He did. But since He is also humorous and downright hilarious, He brought me back to Christianity as a Catholic. I mean, that's worse than being a Baptist for rules. Sure, we can gamble, and we can drink, and we can dance, but we do have a lot of rules, all sorts of stuff that we can and cannot do. And I remember when I was in RCIA going through the program to become Catholic, I remember thinking, it's no wonder that Catholics have 9 kids each. What with all the drinking and the dancing going on. I mean, the Southern Baptists only have 1.5 kids because they had to develop other hobbies, outside interests. But about the time that I was really questioning my life choices that had led me to Catholicism and its giant book of rules, I heard the term cafeteria Catholic. And it was explained to me very disdainfully, I might add, that most Catholics just pick and choose what rules to follow. But it made sense to me at the time. I thought, well, that's how they do it. That's how they follow all these rules. Just like the Baptist fishermen. So I stuck with the RCIA program, because I figured I knew how to handle a cafeteria line. And years later, as I studied more and more, I began to realize that we were actually supposed to be following all the rules as best we can. And I came to realize that the most popular part of the rule book that they never taught us about in RCIA, the most popular section is one that you have to put in yourself. It's a tally sheet for those around you. See, mine has columns and rows where I can put your names in it and all your sins that you're doing. And I can check them off when you commit them. And there's also a spot for if you go to confession or not. And there's a row for me where I can do the same thing. And the game is called Who's the Better Catholic? And the way it works is that as long as my check mark score is lower than your score for number of sins, then I win. It's just like golf. I get to feel superior. I get to ride shotgun and pick the music. Because you got to have rules. But I don't think that Jesus would agree. I don't think that Jesus is really a rules and regs guy in that way, and I don't think that Jesus likes the game, who's the better Catholic. And I think when the Pharisees came to him with their questions of what is the greatest commandment, it was in the same spirit as who's the better Catholic. They were focused too intently on the Jewish law, the way we sometimes focus too intently on the Roman canon. We're not here to follow rules for the sake of following rules. The rules are supposed to be leading us and helping us to love God more and to love our neighbor more. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your mind, with all your soul. And love your neighbor as yourself. The whole law and the prophets depend on these 2 commandments, Jesus said. The second we jerk out our tally sheet and start marking other people's sins, when we start sitting in judgment of our neighbor, then we have stopped loving them. And it doesn't matter how low our own sin score is, if we are missing either of Jesus' 2 commandments, love God and love your neighbor. And if we're practicing these 2 commandments, the rest of all these rules will come. And God does want us to follow the teachings of His church. But if we truly love God and we truly love our neighbor, we will end up following all the rest of it as well as we can. And we may never be good enough Catholics for the Pharisees among us. But you know what? Jesus was never a good enough Jew for the Pharisees around him. The Pharisees were so caught up in who was following what rule that they lost sight of loving God and loving each other. They lost sight of caring for the needy and the immigrants and the widows and the orphans that our first reading from Exodus talks about today. They became preoccupied with their tally sheets and stopped being a witness for God's love for the world. They were not a model for believers, the way that Paul said the Thessalonians were in our second reading today. Love God. Love your neighbor. We may have recreated a rule book that would be the envy of all Pharisees. But that doesn't mean we have to act like Pharisees. God, please give me a heart like yours so that I can love like you love and be a model for believers of how to follow Jesus' greatest commandments.